Have you ever wondered what happens when isolation meets desperation in the darkest corners of America? When families are pushed so far beyond the reach of civilization that they create their own twisted rules for survival? Deep in the shadow-carved valleys of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like secrets, certain bloodlines wrote their names in violence across generations. These weren't just rough mountain folk trying to get by. These were dynasties built on fear, sustained by brutality, and remembered only in hushed warnings passed down through generations. Before we descend into these forgotten hollows, where justice was a foreign concept and mercy was weakness, make sure to hit that subscribe button. What you're about to discover goes far beyond typical mountain feuds or moonshine disputes. We're talking about families so dangerous that their very existence challenges everything you thought you knew about law and order in America. Today, we're exposing the blood-soaked legacies of the most lethal family clans that ever terrorized the Appalachian wilderness. Families whose names became synonymous with death itself. By the end of this series, you'll understand why entire communities would abandon their homes rather than face these mountain dynasties, and why some of their descendants still carry the weight of ancestral sins that echo through these hills today. 1. The Blackwood Clan. In the remote peaks of eastern Tennessee, where roads were nothing more than deer trails and the nearest sheriff lived 3 days' ride away, the Blackwood family established what could only be described as a kingdom of terror. Beginning in 1847, when patriarch Silas Blackwood first settled in Devil's Backbone Ridge, this clan would spend the next 60 years turning 100 square miles of wilderness into their personal hunting ground. Silas arrived with his 3 sons and a wagon full of secrets. Local Cherokee had already abandoned the area, claiming the land was cursed, but Silas saw opportunity where others saw omens. Within months of their arrival, travelers began disappearing along the mountain passes. What made the Blackwoods particularly terrifying wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their methodical approach to it. They studied their victims like predators studying prey, learning their roots, their habits, and their weaknesses. The family operated from a fortified compound built into the mountainside itself, with tunnels carved directly into the rock and lookout posts positioned to spot approaching visitors from miles away. They developed an intricate system of signals, using mirrors and smoke that allowed them to communicate across vast distances without detection. When territorial disputes arose with neighboring settlers, the Blackwoods didn't engage in typical mountain feuds. They simply made entire families vanish overnight. Their most notorious incident occurred in the winter of 1859, when the Henderson family, traveling through the region to claim inherited land, made the mistake of camping near Blackwood territory. 7 family members, including 3 children, disappeared without a trace. Search parties found their wagon burned and their livestock scattered, but no bodies were ever recovered. What they did find were personal belongings, arranged in deliberate patterns around the campsite, almost like trophies displayed as warnings. The Blackwoods perfected what locals came to call the mountain disappearance. Unlike typical murders that left evidence, their victims simply ceased to exist. No witnesses, no bodies, no explanations. They understood that mystery bred more fear than violence, and fear kept people away from their domain. Even federal marshals avoided the region after two separate investigations ended with their agents never returning. What truly set the Blackwoods apart was their multi-generational commitment to violence. While most criminal families eventually produced members who wanted to escape the lifestyle, every Blackwood child was raised from birth to continue the family tradition. They were taught tracking, hunting, and killing with the same care other families taught reading and arithmetic. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed skills that made them nearly unstoppable in their mountain environment. The clan's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of informants and collaborators. They cultivated relationships with certain merchants, postal workers, and even church officials who would provide intelligence about potential targets in exchange for protection. This information network allowed them to identify wealthy travelers, isolated settlers, and anyone carrying valuables through the region. Their downfall began in 1904 when they made the fatal error of targeting a railroad surveyor who turned out to be the nephew of a powerful politician. The resulting investigation involved federal resources, unlike anything previously deployed in the region. Military units, tracking specialists, and even early forensic investigators converged on Devil's Backbone Ridge. When they finally breached the Blackwood compound, they discovered evidence of crimes spanning nearly 6 decades. The tunnels beneath their mountain stronghold revealed a horrifying collection of personal effects from hundreds of victims. Watches, jewelry, weapons, and clothing had been carefully cataloged and stored like a museum of murder. More disturbing were the detailed journals kept by successive generations of Blackwoods, documenting not just their crimes, but their methods, their motivations, and their complete lack of remorse. The last confirmed Blackwood was killed during the federal raid, though local legend insists that some family members escaped deeper into the mountains. Even today, hikers in the region report finding strange arrangements of stones and bones that seem too deliberate to be natural. Some claim these are markers left by surviving Blackwoods, still maintaining their ancestral territory through psychological warfare. 2. The Grimm Brotherhood. If the Blackwoods were methodical predators, the Grimm family were pure chaos incarnate. Operating primarily along the Virginia-West Virginia border between 1823 and 1887, they transformed the peaceful mountain communities of the Shenandoah region into a landscape of perpetual terror. What made the Grimms unique among Appalachian criminal families was their complete unpredictability. While other clans followed certain patterns or codes, the Grimms seemed to delight in random violence that served no purpose beyond their own twisted entertainment. The family was founded by 3 brothers who deserted from the War of 1812 and fled into the mountains to avoid court-martial. Jakob, Wilhelm, and Ludwig Grimm had acquired a taste for violence during their military service, but their desertion revealed something far darker than mere cowardice. They had been conducting unauthorized raids on civilian populations, keeping trophies from their victims, and displaying increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed even their fellow soldiers. Once established in their mountain hideout, the Grimm brothers began recruiting followers from among the region's outcasts and criminals. Unlike typical family operations, the Grimms welcomed anyone willing to embrace their philosophy of absolute brutality. They created a twisted commune where violence was not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of human expression. Members were required to prove their loyalty through increasingly horrific acts against innocent victims. The Grimms operated more like a roving pack of predators than a traditional criminal organization. They would appear without warning in small communities, terrorize the population for days or weeks, then vanish back into the wilderness before authorities could respond. Their attacks followed no logical pattern. They might spare the wealthy and torture the poor, or protect children while murdering their parents. This unpredictability made them impossible to defend against because no one knew what might trigger their violence. Their signature calling card was the arrangement of their victims in tableaux that seemed designed to traumatize anyone who discovered them. Bodies would be positioned to tell grotesque stories, often incorporating elements from fairy tales or folklore in ways that perverted innocent childhood memories. These scenes served both as psychological warfare against local populations and as entertainment for the Grimms themselves, who seemed to view murder as a form of artistic expression. The psychological impact of the Grimms extended far beyond their immediate victims. Entire communities lived in constant fear, never knowing when the family might descend upon them. Parents told their children nightmarish versions of traditional fairy tales, warning them that the real monsters lived in the mountains and wore human faces. These stories became so deeply embedded in regional culture that some are still told today, though few remember their origins in actual historical events. What made the Grimms particularly dangerous was their complete rejection of any moral boundaries. While other criminal families often followed unwritten codes that protected certain categories of people, the Grimms recognized no such limitations. They targeted ministers, teachers, pregnant women, and children with the same casual cruelty they showed everyone else. This wholesale rejection of civilized behavior made them pariahs even among other mountain criminals. Their reign of terror finally ended in 1887 when a coalition of local militias, federal marshals, and volunteer posses cornered them in their mountain stronghold. The final battle lasted 3 days and involved over 200 armed men. When the shooting stopped, 17 Grimm family members and associates lay dead, along with 8 members of the attacking force. The surviving attackers described the Grimm compound as resembling something from a nightmare, with human remains displayed like decorations and evidence of ritualistic torture scattered throughout their caves. The Grimms left no written records, no explanations for their behavior, and no apparent motive beyond pure malevolence. Modern criminologists who have studied the surviving evidence classify them as one of the earliest known examples of organized sadistic killing in American history. Their legacy lives on in the dark folklore of the region, where parents still warn children about the mountain monsters who wear human faces and delight in suffering. 3. The Vance Syndicate. While families like the Blackwoods and Grimms relied on terror and brutality, the Vance clan took a more sophisticated approach to controlling their territory. Operating from the coal fields of southeastern Kentucky beginning in 1856, they created what amounted to a shadow government that controlled every aspect of life in 3 counties through a combination of violence, corruption, and economic manipulation. The Vance Empire was built by Cornelius Vance, a former railroad executive who fled to the mountains after embezzling funds from his company. Unlike other mountain criminals who were driven by desperation or bloodlust, Cornelius possessed the education and business acumen to create a truly organized criminal enterprise. He understood that sustainable power came not from random violence, but from systematic control of resources and information. Within 5 years of establishing himself in the region, Cornelius had assembled a network that included corrupt judges, sheriff's deputies, mine foremen, and even several state legislators. The Vance family didn't just commit crimes, they made crime legal within their territory by controlling the very institutions meant to prevent it. They operated their own courts, collected their own taxes, and enforced their own laws with deadly efficiency. The family's primary source of income came from their control of illegal mining operations that extracted coal from federal lands without permits or safety regulations. They used slave labor consisting of kidnapped drifters, immigrants, and anyone else who wouldn't be missed by the outside world. These workers were housed in underground compounds and worked under conditions so brutal that few survived more than a year. Those who tried to escape were hunted down by Vance tracking teams and made examples of in ways designed to discourage future attempts. What made the Vance operation particularly insidious was their manipulation of legitimate businesses to launder their criminal profits. They established banks, general stores, and transportation companies that appeared completely legal while serving as fronts for their illegal activities. This gave them a veneer of respectability that allowed them to interact with legitimate businessmen and government officials without arousing suspicion. The Vances also pioneered the use of what would later be called psychological warfare against their enemies. Rather than simply killing those who opposed them, they would systematically destroy their victims' lives through economic sabotage, social ostracism, and carefully orchestrated campaigns of harassment. They understood that a broken enemy was more useful than a dead one, as they could serve as an example to others while providing ongoing intelligence about potential threats. Their control extended into every aspect of daily life within their territory. They decided who could open businesses, who could marry whom, and even what children could be taught in schools. Anyone who challenged their authority faced consequences that escalated from economic pressure to social exile to physical violence. This systematic approach to control created a climate of helplessness that was perhaps more effective than outright terror. The Vance dynasty finally crumbled in 1903 when a federal investigation revealed the extent of their criminal empire to officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The resulting trials exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of state government and led to one of the largest criminal prosecutions in American history at that time. However, many family members escaped justice by fleeing to other regions where they established new operations using the same methods that had served them so well in Kentucky. Their legacy lives on in the region's deep distrust of authority and the persistent belief that true power operates in shadows beyond the reach of official law. Even today, some of the businesses and institutions they established continue to operate, though their current connections to criminal activity remain matters of speculation and local whisper. 4. The Thornfield Massacre Masters. In the blood-soaked annals of Appalachian family violence, No name carries more terror than Thornfield. For nearly 40 years, from 1834 to 1873, this clan turned the mountains of eastern North Carolina into a slaughterhouse where human life held no value and death became an art form practiced with meticulous precision. The Thornfield legacy began with Ezra Thornfield, a former butcher from Charleston who fled to the mountains after murdering his business partner in a dispute over money. But Ezra brought more than just homicidal tendencies to his mountain refuge. He possessed an almost scientific fascination with the mechanics of death that would define his family's reputation for generations. Where other mountain criminals killed out of necessity or rage, the Thornfields killed because they had perfected it into a craft. Ezra established his compound in a narrow valley known as Bone Hollow, where he began experimenting with different methods of execution. He kept detailed journals documenting the effectiveness of various techniques, the time required for different approaches, and even sketches of his victims' final expressions. These journals, discovered decades later, revealed a mind that had moved far beyond simple criminality into something approaching scientific inquiry into human suffering. The Thornfield method differed from other mountain families in its deliberate precision. They didn't ambush travelers or raid settlements randomly. Instead, they operated more like a specialized service, accepting contracts from individuals who wanted specific people eliminated. Their reputation for discretion and effectiveness spread throughout the region's criminal underworld, attracting clients from as far away as Richmond and Atlanta. What made the Thornfields particularly feared was their ability to make murders appear accidental or natural. They studied anatomy, poison making, and mechanical engineering to create deaths that would pass even careful examination. A businessman might die from an apparent heart attack. A rival might perish in what seemed like a hunting accident, or an inconvenient witness might succumb to a mysterious illness. The Thornfields understood that suspicion was bad for business, so they perfected the art of invisible murder. Their compound became a twisted laboratory where successive generations refined their techniques. They built specialized rooms designed for interrogation and execution, created tools specifically for inflicting precise amounts of pain, and maintained extensive records of their experiments. Children born into the family were trained from infancy in anatomy, chemistry, and psychology, learning to read human weakness the way other children learned to read books. The family's influence extended through a network of informants who provided intelligence about potential targets throughout the region. They cultivated relationships with undertakers, doctors, and coroners who could ensure that their handiwork went unquestioned. Some of these collaborators were willing participants bought with gold and fear, while others were unwitting accomplices who never realized they were part of a larger conspiracy. The Thornfields also developed what might be considered the first professional assassination training program in American criminal history. They accepted apprentices from other criminal families, teaching advanced techniques in exchange for substantial payments and ongoing loyalty. These graduates spread Thornfield methods throughout the criminal underworld, creating a legacy of sophisticated violence that extended far beyond their mountain stronghold. Their downfall began in 1871 when they accepted a contract to eliminate a federal judge who had been investigating corruption in the region's mining industry. Unknown to the Thornfields, this judge had been working closely with federal investigators who had already identified several of their previous victims. When the judge died from an apparent stroke, the subsequent investigation employed new forensic techniques that revealed evidence of poisoning. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Military units surrounded Bone Hollow, while investigators began exhuming bodies throughout the region using emerging scientific methods to identify victims of Thornfield techniques. The evidence they uncovered was staggering. Over 300 confirmed murders spanning nearly 4 decades, with victims ranging from local farmers to prominent businessmen and government officials. When federal agents finally breached the Thornfield compound, they discovered what one investigator described as a university of death. The family's extensive libraries contained works on anatomy, toxicology, and forensic medicine that were more advanced than those found in most medical schools. Their workshop areas housed precision instruments for creating specialized weapons and devices designed specifically for killing. Most disturbing were the detailed case files they maintained on each victim, complete with photographs, physical measurements, and notes on the effectiveness of different execution methods. The surviving Thornfield family members were either killed resisting arrest or captured and executed following what became known as the Bone Hollow Trials. However, their apprentices and collaborators had already spread throughout the region, carrying Thornfield techniques into other criminal organizations. Modern criminologists studying unsolved murders from the late 1800s often find evidence of methods that can be traced back to Thornfield training. 5. The Murdoch War Machine. The final family in our exploration of Appalachian terror represents perhaps the most militarily sophisticated criminal organization ever to operate in the American mountains. The Murdoch clan, active in the mountains of southwestern Virginia from 1842 to 1889, transformed traditional mountain feuding into something resembling organized warfare, complete with military tactics, advanced weaponry, and strategic planning that would have impressed professional soldiers. Duncan Murdoch, the family patriarch, had served as a sergeant in the Mexican-American War, where he learned military engineering and battlefield tactics that he would later adapt for criminal purposes. Unlike other mountain families who relied on ambush and intimidation, Duncan approached crime as a military campaign with clearly defined objectives, detailed planning, and coordinated execution by trained operatives. The Murdoch compound was built like a fortress, with defensive positions, supply caches, and escape routes that could withstand siege warfare. They maintained an arsenal that included the most advanced weapons available, often acquired through raids on military supply convoys or purchased from corrupt army quartermasters. Their fighters underwent rigorous training in marksmanship, explosives, and small unit tactics that made them formidable opponents for any law enforcement agency. What set the Murdochs apart was their strategic thinking. Rather than simply reacting to threats or opportunities, they developed long-term plans for controlling territory and eliminating opposition. They studied their enemies' strengths and weaknesses, identified key infrastructure targets, and coordinated attacks designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while minimizing risk to their own forces. The family's most notorious operation was the Great Railroad War of 1867, when they declared war on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad for refusing to pay protection money for safe passage through Murdoch territory. Over 6 months, they conducted a systematic campaign of sabotage that included derailing trains, destroying bridges, and assassinating railroad officials. Their attacks were so precisely planned and executed that the railroad was forced to hire a private army to protect its interests. The Murdochs also pioneered the use of terror tactics designed to break enemy morale. They would leave calling cards at attack sites, send threatening messages to their enemies' families, and stage public demonstrations of their capabilities designed to discourage resistance. These psychological warfare techniques were far ahead of their time and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how fear could be weaponized for strategic advantage. Their downfall came when they overreached by attacking a federal armory, believing they could acquire military-grade weapons for a planned expansion of their territory. The assault was successful from a tactical standpoint, but it brought the full weight of federal military forces down upon them. The resulting campaign to eliminate the Murdoch threat involved over 1,000 soldiers and lasted nearly 2 years. The final battle at Murdoch Mountain in 1889 was the largest military engagement fought on American soil between the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. When the shooting stopped, the Murdoch war machine had been completely destroyed, but at a cost that shocked federal officials. The family's military training and defensive preparations had allowed them to inflict casualties that exceeded those suffered in some Civil War battles. The Murdoch legacy lives on in the detailed military records they maintained, which have been studied by historians and military strategists as examples of asymmetric warfare tactics. Their methods influenced other criminal organizations throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, contributing to an escalation of violence that required increasingly sophisticated law enforcement responses. These 5 families represent just the beginning of our journey into Appalachia's darkest secrets. Each clan developed their own unique approach to terror, but all shared a common willingness to cross lines that most humans would never even approach. Their stories reveal how isolation, desperation, and the absence of effective law enforcement could create conditions where the worst aspects of human nature were not just tolerated, but celebrated and refined into systems of organized brutality. The mountains remember everything, and some memories are too dark to forget. As we venture deeper into these blood-soaked chronicles, we encounter families whose very existence challenges our understanding of human nature itself. These weren't desperate survivors clinging to life in harsh conditions. These were dynasties that chose darkness, embraced it, and passed it down through generations like a twisted inheritance. 6. The Ashford Bone Collectors. In the mist-shrouded peaks of eastern Kentucky, where valleys run so deep that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy, the Ashford family established what can only be described as an empire built on human remains. From 1851 to 1894, they transformed the remote wilderness around Skull Creek into a grotesque monument to their obsession with death itself. The family's patriarch, Jeremiah Ashford, arrived in the region as a traveling preacher, carrying with him a wagon full of religious texts and what he claimed were holy relics. Local settlers initially welcomed him, grateful for spiritual guidance in their isolated communities. But Jeremiah's interpretation of Scripture had been warped by years of isolation and an increasingly unstable mind that saw divine messages in human suffering. Within months of his arrival, Jeremiah began preaching about the sacred nature of human bones, claiming they contained the essence of the soul and could be used to commune with the divine. His sermons grew increasingly bizarre, incorporating elements of folk magic and ancient rituals that bore little resemblance to traditional Christianity. What started as eccentric religious beliefs soon evolved into something far more sinister. The Ashfords developed an elaborate theology around death and bone collection that justified their increasingly violent behavior. They believed that by preserving the skeletal remains of their victims, they were ensuring those souls' passage to heaven while gaining spiritual power for themselves. This twisted logic provided them with a sense of righteousness that made their crimes even more chilling, as they genuinely believed they were performing sacred work. Their compound became a macabre cathedral where human bones were arranged in intricate patterns that supposedly held religious significance. Skulls lined shelves like books in a library, femurs formed architectural supports, and smaller bones were fashioned into religious symbols and ceremonial objects. Visitors who stumbled upon their settlement described scenes that haunted their nightmares for decades afterward. The family's method of acquiring new specimens was as calculated as it was horrific. They would pose as traveling missionaries, gaining the trust of isolated families before revealing their true intentions. Their victims were often tortured for days, while the Ashfords performed what they called purification rituals, believing that suffering cleansed the soul and made the eventual bones more spiritually potent. What made the Ashfords particularly dangerous was their ability to recruit followers from among the region's most desperate and mentally unstable residents. Their twisted theology attracted individuals who had been broken by loss, poverty, or mental illness, people who found comfort in the family's promise that death was merely a doorway to spiritual transcendence. These converts became willing participants in increasingly elaborate ceremonies that centered around human sacrifice. The family maintained detailed records of their victims, treating each collection like a scientific specimen. They cataloged the circumstances of each death, the spiritual significance they attributed to different bones, and the supposed divine messages they received from their grisly relics. These records, discovered years later, revealed a systematic approach to murder that combined religious fanaticism with methodical documentation. Their influence spread through the region's network of isolated settlements, where rumors of their power created a climate of terror that extended far beyond their immediate victims. Some communities abandoned their homes entirely rather than risk encountering the bone collectors, while others left offerings at crossroads in hopes of appeasing what they believed were supernatural forces. The Ashford Reign of Terror finally ended in 1894 when a coalition of federal marshals and local militias surrounded their compound during what they called a harvest ceremony. The ensuing battle revealed the full extent of their grotesque operations as attackers discovered chambers filled with thousands of human remains, arranged in patterns that defied comprehension. The sight was so disturbing that several lawmen suffered complete mental breakdowns and never fully recovered. 7. The Redwick Poison Masters. While other families relied on bullets and blades, the Redwick clan perfected the art of death through chemistry. Operating from their stronghold in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia between 1839 and 1881, they developed a reputation as the most subtle and sophisticated killers in all of Appalachia, capable of eliminating targets without leaving any trace of violence. The family's expertise in toxic substances began with matriarch Cordelia Redwick, a former apothecary's assistant who fled to the mountains after being accused of murdering her employer with a mysterious concoction that mimicked natural illness. Cordelia possessed an extensive knowledge of plants, minerals, and chemical compounds that she used to create an arsenal of undetectable poisons capable of producing deaths that appeared completely natural. Unlike other mountain families who operated through fear and intimidation, the Redwicks worked in shadows, their victims often unaware they had been targeted until it was far too late. They accepted contracts from clients throughout the eastern United States, offering a service that appealed to those who needed enemies eliminated without the messy complications of obvious murder. Their reputation for discretion and effectiveness made them the preferred choice for wealthy individuals who wanted problems solved quietly. The Redwick compound included an elaborate laboratory where successive generations refined their techniques and developed new formulations. They cultivated gardens filled with toxic plants, maintained collections of venomous creatures, and operated distillation equipment that would have impressed university chemists. Their library contained works on botany, chemistry, and medicine that were far in advance of contemporary knowledge, much of it acquired through theft from medical schools and scientific institutions. What made the Redwicks particularly dangerous was their understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. They studied their targets for months, learning their habits, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities before striking. They often worked through intermediaries, creating elaborate chains of deniability that made it nearly impossible to trace murders back to their source. Their methods varied depending on the specific requirements of each contract. Some victims died quickly from fast-acting toxins that mimicked heart attacks or strokes, while others succumbed slowly to poisons that produced symptoms resembling wasting diseases or gradual organ failure. The family took pride in their ability to tailor each death to appear consistent with the victim's age, health, and lifestyle. The Redwicks also pioneered the use of what they called environmental poisoning, contaminating water sources, food supplies, or household items to eliminate entire families or communities when circumstances required. These mass poisoning events were often attributed to natural causes, like contaminated wells or diseased livestock, allowing the family to collect payment while avoiding suspicion. Their downfall came when they accepted a contract to eliminate a federal investigator who had been tracking a series of suspicious deaths throughout the region. Unknown to the Redwicks, this investigator had been working with early forensic scientists who were developing new methods for detecting toxic substances in human remains. When the investigator died from an apparent stomach ailment, the subsequent examination revealed the traces of a rare plant alkaloid that could only have been produced through sophisticated chemical processing. The investigation that followed employed the most advanced scientific techniques available at the time, including chemical analysis of tissue samples and botanical surveys of the region's plant life. Federal agents eventually traced the poison back to the Redwick compound, where they discovered evidence of crimes spanning over 4 decades. The family's detailed records revealed hundreds of murders committed throughout the eastern United States, making them responsible for one of the largest killing sprees in American criminal history. 8. The Galloway Terror Network. In the remote reaches of eastern Tennessee, where mountain peaks create natural barriers that isolate communities for months at a time, the Galloway family constructed something unprecedented in Appalachian criminal history: a communications network that allowed them to coordinate terror across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. From 1845 to 1888, they operated what amounted to an early organized crime syndicate that combined traditional mountain violence with sophisticated intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The network was established by brothers Caleb and Micah Galloway, former telegraph operators who had deserted from the Confederate Army and fled into the mountains to avoid execution for selling military intelligence. Their technical knowledge allowed them to create a system of signal stations using mirrors, flags, and eventually primitive electrical devices that could relay messages across vast distances almost instantaneously. The Galloway network consisted of dozens of outposts scattered throughout the region, each manned by family members or trusted associates who served as both intelligence gatherers and tactical coordinators. These stations monitored traffic along mountain roads, tracked the movements of law enforcement officials, and coordinated attacks with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. What made the Galloways particularly effective was their ability to strike simultaneously at multiple targets across their territory, creating the impression that they possessed far more resources than they actually commanded. A merchant caravan might be ambushed in one valley while their competitors were being eliminated 50 miles away, all coordinated through their communications network to maximize confusion and terror. The family also pioneered the use of psychological warfare on a regional scale, spreading false information through their network to manipulate their enemies and create conflicts between rival groups. They would plant evidence suggesting that one family was betraying another, or spread rumors about law enforcement activities that would cause their targets to make tactical mistakes that played into Galloway hands. Their intelligence gathering capabilities were so sophisticated that they often knew about planned law enforcement operations before the officers involved had received their orders. This advance warning allowed them to prepare ambushes, evacuate threatened positions, or simply disappear into the wilderness until the danger passed. Local sheriffs reported feeling like they were fighting an enemy who could read their minds. The Galloway network also served as a coordination system for other criminal families throughout the region, providing intelligence services and tactical support in exchange for tribute payments and operational cooperation. This created a loose confederation of mountain criminals that was far more dangerous than any individual family could have been on its own. Their most audacious operation occurred in 1873 when they coordinated simultaneous attacks on 3 county courthouses, destroying records that could have been used to prosecute various criminal activities while making off with substantial amounts of tax money. The attacks were timed to occur within minutes of each other, despite being separated by distances that should have made coordination impossible with available technology. The network's downfall began when federal investigators realized they were dealing with an organized conspiracy rather than random criminal activity. By studying the timing and coordination of various attacks, they were able to identify the locations of several signal stations and begin mapping the Galloway communication system. Once they understood how the network operated, they were able to intercept messages and feed false information back through the system. The final assault on the Galloway network involved over 300 federal agents and soldiers working in coordinated teams to simultaneously attack every known outpost. The operation required months of planning and represented one of the largest law enforcement actions ever undertaken in the Appalachian region. When the dust settled, the family's 43-year reign of terror had finally ended, but not before they had demonstrated how technology could be used to amplify criminal capabilities far beyond traditional limitations. 9. The Sinclair Flesh Trade. Perhaps no family in Appalachian history embodied pure evil more completely than the Sinclairs, who operated what can only be described as a human trafficking and torture enterprise from their stronghold in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. Between 1837 and 1879, they reduced human beings to mere commodities, buying and selling people like livestock, while subjecting their victims to horrors that challenged the very concept of human dignity. The Sinclair operation was established by Matthias Sinclair, a former overseer on a South Carolina plantation who fled north after being accused of murdering several slaves in particularly brutal fashion. Rather than abandoning his sadistic practices, Matthias saw opportunity in the chaos and isolation of the mountain regions, where the absence of effective law enforcement created perfect conditions for his twisted enterprises. The family compound was designed like a prison, with cells carved directly into the mountainside and guard positions that allowed constant surveillance of their captives. They maintained detailed records of their human inventory, cataloging each victim's physical characteristics, skills, and potential market value with the same clinical detachment used by livestock traders. Their victims came from a variety of sources: travelers who made the mistake of seeking shelter at Sinclair establishments, immigrants who had been promised work in the region, runaway slaves seeking freedom in the mountains, and even local residents who had fallen into debt or somehow offended the family. Once captured, these people became property to be bought, sold, or used according to Sinclair whims. What made the Sinclairs particularly despicable was their development of what they called conditioning programs, designed to break their victims' will and transform them into compliant slaves. These programs combined physical torture, psychological manipulation, and systematic humiliation to destroy any sense of individual identity or hope for escape. The techniques they developed were so effective that even victims who were eventually freed often remained psychologically damaged for life. The family also operated a network of breeding programs designed to produce children who could be raised from birth as slaves, never knowing any other existence. These children were trained for specific roles. Some became household servants, others were taught trades that made them valuable in labor markets, and still others were groomed for more disturbing purposes that defied civilized description. Their customer base extended throughout the southeastern United States, including wealthy plantation owners seeking specialized slaves, industrial operators needing cheap labor for dangerous work, and individuals with more perverse interests that the Sinclairs were willing to accommodate for the right price. This network of clients provided both income and protection, as many purchasers had strong incentives to ensure that Sinclair operations remained hidden from authorities. The family's most horrific innovation was their development of what they called product modification, using surgical procedures and chemical treatments to alter their victims according to customer specifications. These modifications ranged from simple branding and scarification to more complex procedures that permanently disabled victims to prevent escape or rebellion. Their reign of terror finally ended in 1879, when a group of escaped victims made their way to federal authorities and provided testimony that led to a massive investigation. The subsequent raid on the Sinclair compound revealed evidence of crimes so shocking that many details were never made public to avoid traumatizing the general population. Over 200 victims were recovered from the compound, though many were so psychologically damaged that they never fully recovered their ability to function in normal society. 10. The Covenant of Blood. Our final entry in this catalog of mountain terror represents perhaps the most bizarre and disturbing criminal organization ever to operate in American territory. The group known only as the Covenant operated from hidden locations throughout the Appalachian chain between 1829 and 1896, combining elements of religious fanaticism, occult practices, and systematic murder into a cult-like organization that attracted followers from across the eastern United States. The Covenant was founded by a charismatic preacher known only as Father Solomon, whose real identity was never established despite decades of investigation. Solomon preached a twisted theology that combined corrupted Christian imagery with ancient pagan rituals, claiming that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain spiritual balance in the world. His followers believed that by killing specific types of people at designated times and places, they could influence supernatural forces and gain power over life and death itself. Unlike other criminal families that operated within specific territories, the Covenant was mobile, moving their operations throughout the mountain regions according to what they claimed were divine instructions received through ritual ceremonies. Their camps were temporary but elaborate affairs, featuring altars constructed from human bones, sacred circles marked with symbols that predated known written languages, and ceremonial chambers where their most horrific rituals took place. The group's membership fluctuated between 50 and 300 individuals, drawn from the ranks of religious outcasts, mentally unstable drifters, and people who had been broken by tragedy or loss. New members underwent initiation ceremonies that involved witnessing and participating in human sacrifice, ensuring their complicity and making escape psychologically difficult, even for those who later questioned the organization's practices. Their victim selection followed complex rules based on astrological calculations, physical characteristics, and supposed spiritual significance. They maintained detailed charts tracking celestial movements, lunar phases, and seasonal changes that supposedly indicated when specific types of sacrifices were required. These calculations were so elaborate that the group employed individuals whose sole responsibility was maintaining these mystical schedules. The Covenant's influence extended far beyond their immediate membership through a network of sympathizers who provided intelligence, supplies, and safe passage in exchange for supposed spiritual benefits. Many of these collaborators were respected members of their communities who secretly believed in the group's teachings while maintaining facades of conventional respectability. Their most disturbing practice was the recruitment of entire families who would disappear from their communities to join the Covenant's nomadic existence. These family units were particularly valuable because they provided a self-sustaining population that could be manipulated more easily than individual recruits. Children born into the organization knew no other way of life and accepted its practices as normal aspects of human existence. The group's downfall began in 1894 when a surviving victim managed to escape during a ceremony and provide authorities with detailed information about their operations and membership. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of their activities, including evidence linking them to hundreds of disappearances throughout the eastern United States over nearly 7 decades. The final confrontation occurred in 1896 when federal agents and military units surrounded what they believed was the Covenant's main encampment in a remote valley of eastern Kentucky. The ensuing battle lasted for 2 days and resulted in the deaths of most remaining members, though some apparently escaped into the wilderness and were never captured. These 10 families represent the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, stories that reveal how isolation and desperation could transform human beings into monsters whose crimes challenged the very foundations of civilized society. Their legacies live on in the region's folklore, in the scars they left on the landscape, and in the generational trauma that still echoes through communities they terrorized. But our exploration of Appalachian darkness is far from complete. These families, horrific as they were, operated within a larger ecosystem of violence and lawlessness that shaped the character of the entire region. The mountains hold more secrets, darker truths, and stories that go beyond individual family crimes to reveal systematic patterns of terror that defined entire communities for generations.